Good afternoon. As you heard, my name is Angie Penland, and I'm so proud to represent FNBO today. FNBO is proud to be the official bank of Colorado State University, and we are thrilled to once again partner with the CSU Office of International Programs as the lead sponsor of this year's Global Engagement Distinguished Speaker. Our team is as excited as you about this opportunity to hear from Reverend Tutu and learn more about her impactful and inspiring lifelong commitment to human rights. Our bank has more than 160 years experience of doing what's right for our customers, employees, and the communities we serve. Over the last 2 years, FNBO has invested nearly $10 million in our Colorado communities in the form of donations, sponsorships, community development grants, and impact investments. With 96 locations across our 7-state footprint and 23 branches right here in Colorado, our team is passionate about cultivating shared long-term local relationships with the goal of helping our customers and communities thrive. On behalf of FNBO, thank you for joining us today and for supporting Colorado State University and the Global Engagement Distinguished Speaker Series.
Thank you, Angie. I would now like to invite Joyce McConnell, President of Colorado State University, and the Reverend Naomi Tutu to on screen, and so the President McConnell can officially welcome today's speaker.
Well, I can't tell you how excited I am to welcome Reverend Tutu to Colorado State University. Thank you for all of you who are joining us today. It's my great honor and great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce the Reverend Naomi Tutu as this year's Global Engagement Distinguished Speaker for Colorado State University. I'm excited to introduce you all to Reverend Tutu, but I want to start by expressing my gratitude to our Vice Provost for International Affairs, Kathleen Fairfax, and her amazing team in the Office of International Programs, and also for FNBO Bank for sponsoring this today. Thank you all for organizing this important event. Colorado State University is a world-class global university and has been almost since its inception. It has had a mandate to share international perspectives with our community. At this signature annual event, we're privileged to hear from and engage with thought leaders from around the world. By doing so, we foster a more informed and more significantly connected community, better able to address the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. This year, we're acutely aware of challenges that pay no regard to international boundaries, in particular, those brought about by the global pandemic. As a result, instead of welcoming Reverend Tutu to Fort Collins, where we could show her our beautiful campus, we welcome her today via Zoom. We're also aware of challenges that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, especially some of those related to gender and race. Reverend Tutu's experiences growing up Black and female under the apartheid regime in South Africa and her career as a human rights activist make her uniquely prepared to discuss those difficult issues. Reverend Tutu is the daughter of Nobel laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu and her mother, Leah Tutu. And I hope I'm pronouncing your mother's name correctly. South Africa, she had the opportunity to live in many communities and countries. She was educated in Swaziland, the United States, and England, and has divided her adult life between South Africa and the United States. As an ordained clergy member in the Episcopal Church, she currently serves as missioner for racial and economic equity at the Cathedral of All Souls in Asheville, North Carolina, and her new role in Beverly Hills. And so I'm so pleased that we were able to welcome you the other coast. Reverend Tutu began her public speaking career as a college student at Berea College in Kentucky during the 1970s, when she was invited to speak at churches and community groups, colleges, and universities about her experiences growing up in apartheid South Africa. And if you're not familiar with Berea, it's really an amazing and unique place that has a very long history of being dedicated to educating all kinds of people from all places with a very deep collective sense of responsibility, and particularly for justice and equity issues. Since then, she has become a sought-after speaker for a wide array of groups and events, including business and professional associations, conferences, political, civic, and religious organizations. As well as speaking and preaching, Reverend Tutu establishes Nozizwe Consulting, dedicated to bringing different groups together to learn from and celebrate our differences and acknowledge our shared humanity. Nozizwe means mother of many lands, really appropriate, in the Xhosa language, and is the name Reverend Tutu was given by her maternal grandmother, who must have been able to see the future. Through Nozizwe, Reverend Tutu has led truth and reconciliation workshops for groups dealing with different types of conflict and offered educational and partnership trips to South Africa for high school teachers and church groups and women's associations. The trips always emphasize opportunities to share stories and experiences and connect us across the human experience. In the same way, bringing individuals like Reverend Tutu here to share her stories and experiences brings the world to Colorado State University and helps foster a diverse and inclusive community, one where every person has a sense of belonging and the ability to thrive and succeed. That is one of the essential things we do, both at CSU with its land-grant tradition of an inclusion and access to world in which we please join me in welcoming the Reverend Naomi Tutu.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me as part of your global programs. It is indeed an honor to be here with you in this, towards this end of Women's History Month, to talk about building gender coalitions and seeking common ground, seeking justice. I would like to start by asking us to have a moment of silence for the 8 people who were killed in Atlanta last week and the 10 who were killed in Colorado, in Boulder this week. As we were talking just a little earlier, thank you, about how this pandemic has closed us away from so many of the things that we used to do, the ability to travel freely, the ability to hug those we love, the ability to meet in person rather than giving presentations via Zoom. And yet, one of the things that we didn't realize, or at least I didn't realize, that we were not seeing was these mass shootings. That it is with sadness that as we are starting our path back to a new normalcy, maybe not back to, but forward to a new normalcy, it is very sad that one of the things that would come back at full force would be something that we could live without, gun violence. And I believe that as we start thinking about what are we planning our world to look like when we come out of COVID, that would be one of the conversations that we desperately need to have around gun violence and access to guns in this country. So I will take that as kind of my jumping off point in talking about how do we take these experiences that we have had over the last couple of years and build towards a new world, a new normal that doesn't take us back to the normal that we came from, but rather imagines and works towards a new normal, a normal that takes into account the things that COVID showed us as a world, the places of weakness in our communities, in our countries, and in our world. The places that the way that we have been shown how so many of our people around the world and in this country have actually been living on an edge, an economic edge, a political edge, a social edge that has not allowed them to thrive. And that if we are talking about how do we move forward, then let us learn from those places that we saw holes in our society. And that the fact that so many of these spaces, the emptiness, the lacking of the safety net have impacted disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and particularly women of color in not just in this country, but around the world. It has shown us how, in terms of employment, that frontline workers who we designated as countries, and in fact, in much of the world, that we designated as frontline essential workers, that many of those are people of color. Many of those essential frontline jobs are jobs that are not well paid. Many of those frontline essential jobs that we spoke about were jobs where people did not have the ability to choose not to go to work, to choose to become virtual in their work. That those essential workers, the nurses, doctors, yes, but the people cleaning the hospitals, the people stacking our grocery shelves, the people cooking and delivering food from restaurants, the people taking care of the elderly in residential communities, that those were predominantly people of color, and over half women. And yet we designated them as essential workers, as frontline workers, as being necessary for the continuing of our communities. And yet we did not treat them as essential human beings, as Kelly Brown Douglas has said, that we have not taken into account their needs, their concerns, even their families in designating them as essential workers. We did not then change the ways in which we interacted with them economically or socially, that we did not offer a way for safety for them in the same way that we worked to build safety for those of us in so-called professional settings who were able then to take our lives online. And if we are wanting to move ourselves forward into a new, a better world in our 21st century, then we have to take into account the ways in which we experience racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, homophobia, the ways in which all of those isms and phobias impact us differently, the ways in which we walk into situations and settings with different privileges and with different burdens, depending on our race, our gender, our ethnicity, our religious affiliation. And I talk about striving for justice and seeking common ground in this context because I believe that until and unless we listen to one another's stories, that we claim each of us the places where we are privileged in our society, as well as the places that we are marginalized. That until and unless we are willing to share our full stories as human beings, as how we enter into any room or any space, then we will not be working towards a new normal. So let me talk about what I imagine working towards a new normal looks like, what it means when I speak about striving for justice, seeking common ground, or when I talk about building gender coalitions across racial lines. I talk about accepting and acknowledging the differences that we bring into the world based on who we are. Now, when I say accepting those differences, I am not saying that those differences, therefore, are a delineation and a marking spot where we do not cross the line, because that is an extreme position. And the other extreme is that we don't talk about the differences at all, that we pretend that there are no differences. You know, it is that conversation when somebody says, oh, I am colorblind. I don't see race. I just see human beings. And whenever I hear that, unless the person is actually colorblind, my first reaction is, you are somebody I want to run as far away from as I possibly can. Because being colorblind is not moving us towards justice. Pretending, in fact, to be colorblind is not in any way helping our world to deal with the divisions that are being exacerbated daily by political and some religious leaders. To say that you don't see difference is not, in fact, an empowering position to have. I tell people all the time, you know, if you tell me that you don't see color, then I worry about you, because I know I am a Black woman. You know, I wake up in the morning, I look in the mirror, and I see a Black woman. And on most days, I'm pretty happy to see her. Some days, I think that she's absolutely an outstandingly amazing Black woman. Other days, I'm thinking this Black woman needs to go back to bed for another couple of days in order to be able to face the world and herself. But the basic fact that I am a Black woman is nowhere in question for me. And so when somebody says that they don't see my color, that to me is not a statement that says that you accept me. In fact, it is a statement that says to me that in order to accept me, you must ignore a part of who I am. Because a part of who I am is a Black woman. And I don't want to not be a Black woman. I am very happy most of the time being a Black woman. I am honored by the history that I come out of. I am so proud of the ancestors who struggled for me. I am hopeful for the future of my children. And I am happy to be a Black woman. What I do not like is the way in which my race and gender is used often to marginalize me, to make my story not as important as other people's story, to make my voice not as heard as other people's voices. It is not about not wanting to be Black. I am happy as a Black woman. What I do want is a society that is willing to see me as a Black woman and to see me as someone who has something to offer my community, has something to offer my church, has something to offer my employer, has something to offer my neighbor, has something to offer our world, and also needs something in return from all of those places. I need to be recognized as fully human. I need to be known for the stories that I bring into our community. That it is not about trying to pretend that being a Black woman has not impacted my access, has not impacted my experiences in the world. And so when I come into a conversation about a new just world, I come into that conversation, bringing into that conversation all of the things that have made me who I am today. My experiences growing up under apartheid, where I had a whole government system that was telling me I was less than other human beings simply because of the color of my skin. That I grew up in a system that tried to tell me that I would not be able to achieve the things that I saw others achieving simply because I was a Black person. And yet, in the midst of that government policy, in the midst of those statements, that brainwashing that was being attempted by the apartheid government, I also grew up in a community that let me know that apartheid was not the reality of God's world, that that this was not the final answer to our lives as African people on the African continent, that apartheid was not the final story for South Africa. I grew up in a community that encouraged me to strive for education as much as I could, even in the face of a government that told me that I could not learn. That I grew up in a community where we had heroes and heroines who had given up everything, given up their professions in order to fight for liberation, given up their freedom in order to fight for an end to apartheid, given up even their lives in order to free all of South Africa from the scourge of apartheid. So I came from a country that tried to tell me that I was less than, but I also have the experience of a community within that country that stood up to that oppression. And both of those stories are part of how I walk into any room. I walk in with the experience of having as a young person, having seen my parents and grandparents and elders in our community disrespected by young white women and men simply because my parents and grandparents and all of the adults in my community were people of color. So I walk into any experience with that knowledge, with having lived through that. I also walk into any experience with the knowledge that I come from a long line of people who have known that justice is indivisible, that there is no way that we can say someone in this country is free if there is anyone in the country who is not free. So I come into the space talking about the philosophy that I was raised in a philosophy of Ubuntu that talks about our shared humanity, that talks about the ways in which we are connected. And now I've talked about how I walk into the room because I have to be clear about how I walk into a room so that I give space for the others walking into this conversation with me to also be clear about who they are and how they come into this place that we are meeting, whether it is on a university campus, whether it is in a church setting, whether it is in peace negotiations, whether it is in community activism, that how I come in and my knowledge of how I come in to that space is important for me to be able then to be open to how others come into the space. We have to be willing to name the ways in which we are privileged in any given space, as well as the ways in which we are marginalized. So I know that, for instance, I am privileged in that I've gone through university, I got degrees, I have had access to educational opportunities that are not the general experience of the vast majority of people in our world, that the vast majority of people in our world do not have access to tertiary education. So I know already that I walk in with that level of privilege. In this country, I know that I also walk in with a level of privilege that is simply because I am a Christian woman in this country that recognizes Christianity as the basic religion and is recognized in so many ways that, you know, we don't even have to ask questions about Christian holidays, that they're just accepted, that Christian holidays are holidays in this country, that I am not asked to constantly defend my faith, that when a Christian man murders a number of people, I am not asked as a Christian to stand up and denounce him and say he does not represent Christianity. That is the general belief, right? That Christians are good and bad, and that not one particular brand of Christianity represents all of Christianity. Because that is not true for our Muslim sisters and brothers, our Sikh sisters and brothers, our Hindu sisters and brothers, that access into the conversational space is not the same, that their faith is not accepted as a generally understood faith, a basis for our conversations, and that they are asked often and often to denounce members of their faith and to speak up and say, this is not all Muslims, right? This does not represent all Muslims. This does not represent all Hindus. This does not represent all Sikhs. So that is a place where I recognize my privilege. And so if we are going to build common ground, if we are going to try and build a new just world, we need to start our conversations clear about how we walk into the space. I know that I was ordained late in life. It's another story for another day, another long story for another long day. But and I was talking. I have a cohort of sisters who I went through my last year of seminary with, and we are all ordained Episcopal priests now, and we talk about our experiences as ordained women. That what does it mean to be an ordained woman in a denomination that I can remember when the first women were ordained in our denomination. So it is not ancient history. And when we talk about those experiences, what some we have in absolute common, that, you know, that people feel free to say things to women clergy that they would never say to men clergy, about our hair, about how we are dressed, about our weight. I mean, I don't even want to shock you, but you would be surprised where people are willing to go with women clergy. But one of the interesting things is that the rest of our group, our clergy cohort, these 6 of us, are all white women, and added on, when we spoke about these experiences, they spoke about being out in the world in a collar, and the actually very aggressive, often, responses that they have had from people, that people have come up to them and challenged them for having a clerical collar on. And you know, one of my friends said that somebody came up to her and said, "Does your bishop know that you are wearing a collar?" And she's like, "I would guess, since he ordained me." But that this idea of that women as clergy people are still not quite accepted. But my experience as a Black woman in a collar was that the ways in which I was treated in the community that I lived in changed. I mean, I had doors held open for me. People said good morning to me in places where they had never greeted me in the past. And so I tell that story just to say that when I say, when we walk in terms of privilege and marginalization, to also know that those places can be fluid, that they can be places where what has been marginalization opens a door because of having been marginalized before. So if we say that, okay, this is the work that we want to do, and we start that work by saying we recognize that we come into any situation with different experiences, that we come into any situation with the impact of our religion, the impact of our gender, the impact of our immigration status. I love to tell the story. it's got nothing to do with this today, but I taught at the University of Hartford, and I remember challenging a student about his writing, and saying to him, you know, your essay, the content is great, and I really want to read it, but your grammar and writing style is really difficult to navigate. So I would like you to take this paper to the writing lab and ask them to help you work through the grammar and syntax of it all. And then to resubmit. So that was their first draft of a paper, and then resubmit it to me. And sure enough, he resubmitted the paper. And as I was reading it, I'm like, there doesn't seem to have been any changes made here in terms of grammar. And so I send him an email to say, you know, I am here grading your paper, and I'm concerned because I'm not seeing the kind of work that I would have expected the writing lab to have helped you with. What happened? And he wrote back to me, was like, well, you know, nobody has ever told me that I have problems with my writing before, and you're a foreigner anyway, you're not even from here. And I was just like, oh my gosh, okay, so that's where we're going today. It's not that I am teaching you. The fact that the primary thing in your mind is that I am an immigrant. So I tell that story simply to say that, you know, how we walk into any given space is impacted by all manner of things. But if we are going to move forward, then once we have to be cognizant of the different ways that we are impacted and impact the world, the different ways in which race plays a role in what our opportunities are, the different ways in which gender plays a role in what our opportunities are, our ethnicity, our religion, our sexual orientation. All of these are differences that, and that's not to say that I've covered all the ways that we are different, please. But that the differences that we bring. But for a community that wants to be one that is inclusive and is working towards justice, then what we do with those differences is the important thing. So that first, that we acknowledge that we come with different experiences. And then we pay attention to how those different experiences have affected how we get into this space, right? So that how we are seen in any given space is partly due to the ways in which we are seen in society. That, you know, seeing a Black woman at our church and not wearing a collar, I have been asked, you know, where's the kitchen? Can you help me get coffee? And, you know, normally I am somebody who tries to be hospitable, and that would not bother me if it was a request that was just as likely to be made of my white colleagues or my male colleagues. And the truth of the matter is those aren't requests that are likely to be made of them. And so in building our community, we have to be able to use the times when we are privileged to speak out in support of those who are being marginalized. A few years ago, I was speaking at a Church Women United event, and I talked about, you know, just the weariness of being Black in our community. that, you know, just the silly racism, the daily, like those daily pinpricks that just are tiring. So I was talking about, you know, being stopped by police in my neighborhood. I was talking about having my son identified as a problem in his school until it became clear that I was an involved parent and could come to the school at any given time and be in conversation with whoever was seeing my son as a problem. That so those experiences have impacted how I then walk into educational situations, into work situations. It it has all played a role. So as I was telling them the story, one of the women said, "You know, I often hear Black women talking about the tiring experiences of just daily life. And what would it be? What could we as white women do to show solidarity and to be stopping in any instance the impact of racism?" And I said, you know, it is not even that complicated. So, for instance, when you see a Black woman in a department store being followed by store security, and that Black woman, who, if it's me, this is what I do, I turn around and I'm like, so what is it that would make you think that I am the most suspicious person in this shop? That would make you want to follow me around? And I don't know how many times I've said that and have had the person say, "I wasn't following you," or "No, this is all random that how we walk around the store." And that is, you know, adding salt to the wound, right? That not only am I being followed, but then the attempt to make it seem as though I am overly sensitive. And I said, what would be an amazing occurrence for me in a situation like that would be just to have just one white person say, "But no, I you've been following her. I saw it too." And again, I mean, that's not a dramatic, huge political statement or march or even writing a letter to the editor. It is one small aspect of helping using privilege to bring to light the way in which others are marginalized and to interrupt that marginalization. And if we are building coalitions, if we are building a just society, then we require those who are privileged to not just be aware of their privilege, but to also use their privilege in those spaces to, interrupt the marginalization of others, to query the dispossession, to query the oppression, and to raise up a different way of being in the world. As we move, I believe, I hope, I pray, as we move into a world where we are emphasizing justice, where we are emphasizing political justice, economic justice, climate justice, that environmental justice, that as we move into a world that we say that is what we are about, then we have an opportunity to show, to model in small ways what it is we are trying to live out in large ways. So I spoke about at the beginning a little bit about Ubuntu as as being for me a foundational way of looking at the struggle for justice. And Ubuntu teaches that that struggle starts at our most fundamental level, that our struggle for justice starts in how we interact with those we are closest to, how we interact within our families, how we interact in our churches, how we interact in our schools. So Ubuntu says that for Naomi to be somebody who is invested in justice, first of all, Naomi must recognize her full humanity. Naomi must be aware and claim the fact that I am fully human and that there is nothing that a system or a person can tell me about me as a Black woman that is about being less than human. And and I love in this context the stories about President Mandela when he was in prison, because when they talk to the prison guards about their experience with him, the prison guards say, you know, we met a man who recognized our humanity and was interested in us as human beings, interested in our stories, interested in our families, interested in our hopes and our dreams in ways that our supervisors were not even. But for me, what is even more fundamental about what they say is that they also say, and he was a man who demanded that we respect his humanity, that he that there was nothing, even as a prisoner, even as being forced to work in a lime quarry, even as being forced to sleep on the hard ground, even as food rations were determined by race, that President Mandela held on to his deep knowledge of himself as completely human and a dignified and worthy of respect human being, and therefore able to then turn that offering to others, which is which is Ubuntu writ all the way through. So that so as we start as people who say we are striving for justice and we are guided by principles of Ubuntu as we do so, we start off saying, Naomi, Black woman, priest, amazing, made in God's image, and that's how I walk in the world. But that also means that I walk in the world recognizing that everyone else I meet is also, whether they are indigenous, whether they are Black, whether they are Asian American, whether they are white, whether they are female, whether they are male, whether they are trans, whether they, I mean, whatever the humanity that I encounter is a fully human being made in God's image and therefore deserving of respect. And if we start at that place, if we start at that place of our shared humanity, then it is easier to have those conversations about the ways in which identities are used as ways to oppress and divide us. And it means that we become less willing to accept those ways in which those in power attempt to divide us and say, yes, we look different, we speak different languages, we like different foods, we dance to different music, and those differences are the flavoring that makes our world an interesting place. Those differences do not take away from anyone's fundamental humanity. And that's how we build. That's how we build a just society. It is in acknowledging, accepting, celebrating our differences, and basing our conversations, our work, our interactions on the sure knowledge that we are each in human beings of infinite worth more than we can even imagine ourselves. And if we start at that place of acknowledging, accepting, celebrating our differences, and recognizing our fundamental humanity, we then are well on our path to a community of justice, to a community that recognizes and accepts our differences, not as reasons to hate, but as opportunities to learn. Thank you.
Reverend Tutu, thank you so much for your inspirational words. Very impactful. And I know the audience is very appreciative of what you have to say.
Thank you.
Maybe time for one question. We had a number of very good ones, but related to what you were just ending on, question was about facing uncomfortable truths. So how do you encourage people to acknowledge the past and how it might influence a certain person's condition or opportunities or life experiences if they insist on let's just leave the past in the past?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's an awesome question. And truth be told, that when we have the courage to face our past and to claim every part of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, that is actually our path to liberation. And I like to share in this context a story again about President Mandela. And so most of the people here are probably too young to know that following our elections in 1994, South Africa was kind of the flavor of the day, and people were in love with South Africa, and particularly in love with our president, who had come out of 30 years in prison and had, with no bitterness, and simply saying, we need to build a new South Africa. And so, so we would be as South Africans, traveling, if you're traveling in the world, and then somebody says, so where are you from? Oh, yes, I'm from South Africa, the country of Nelson Mandela, who came out of prison after, blah, 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 all these wonderful things. What a wonderful country we are to have given the world this man. And President Mandela himself said, you cannot, as South Africans, go out into the world and say we are from the country of Mandela if you are not willing to say we are from the country of de Kock. And Eugene de Kock was the head of one of the murder squads that the South African government had. And he tells his story in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the extent of the violence that he participated in, and the way that he believed that what he was doing was for the country. And so what President Mandela was saying was that you cannot choose which part of your history you are going to claim. If you're going to claim me, then you have to claim de Kock, because both of those stories are the stories of South Africa. Both of those stories have led us to where we are now. And I do think that part of our difficulty, particularly, I think, in this country, in the US. I think that part of the difficulty is that we have been socialized and have socialized our young people that history is something to be proud of, not something to learn from. So then we only can tell the stories of our history that make us proud. And we hide from the stories of our history that show why it is that Black people are at the bottom economically still, that show how it is that Indigenous people suffer from alcoholism and unemployment and suicide at such high rates, given the history that led to the reservation system. So if we want to move forward, we have to do, as Mandela said, you cannot pick which part of your history you are going to share, which part of your history you are going to learn from. You have to learn from all aspects of your story.
Thank you. And I think, unfortunately, we are out of time. We could probably listen to you talk. No, we could listen to you talk all day. So that is wonderful. We really appreciate your words of inspiration today. And we hope that you have a wonderful day as well. And thank you to all of our audience for participating. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more questions, but we have learned a lot. No,
I tell people
fine.
that I apologize, that I'm a priest and then I stop preaching. Sorry.
No need to apologize. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.